Hey guys, tonight we begin with how Appalachian cabins stayed warm before modern heating, and the first thing to know is that the old answer is almost backwards. A mountain cabin did not stay warm because thick logs somehow turned it into a wooden thermos. Many of these houses were drafty, unevenly heated, and brutally dependent on a fire that had to be fed by hand. The real trick was smaller and more practical. Families reduced the space they had to heat, sealed the worst gaps, built daily life around one hot hearth, and accepted that warm might mean one corner of one room rather than the whole house. That matters because a winter night in the southern mountains could turn a simple household problem into hours of work. Heat was not something you switched on. It was wood you cut, carried, dried, burned, watched, and replaced. If you enjoy these quiet dives into the ordinary survival systems hidden inside old homes, like the video, subscribe, and comment with the coldest place you've ever spent a winter night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One useful place to begin is Cades Cove in what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park. John Oliver, his wife Lucretia, and their young daughter Mary arrived there in 1818. Their family became part of a settlement landscape where small log houses, barns, corn cribs, smoke houses, and other working buildings slowly accumulated as farms became more established. The park still preserves an unusually rich collection of historic log structures from mountain communities like Cades Cove, Catalookie, Oconaluftee, and Rawang 83. But the word cabin can mislead us. It brings up a polished picture. Orange firelight, heavy blankets, snow outside, maybe a kettle humming while everyone sits comfortably in shirt sleeves. Historic buildings tell a rougher story. A pre-1856 log cabin preserved at the Tilson Farm in Unicoi County, Tennessee, was a single pen structure, essentially one main room, with a large rough stone fireplace at one end. It stood on stone piers. Other surviving Appalachian houses show the same basic logic: small rooms, large fireplaces, and in some cases low ceilings with usable attic space above. These were not accidental details. They shaped how heat behaved inside the house. A smaller room contains less air than a large one. A lower ceiling keeps the occupied space closer to the fire. And when cooking, eating, mending, talking, and much of the evening all happen in the same room, you do not need to make every distant corner comfortable. You concentrate people where the useful heat already is. That sounds obvious until you compare it with a modern house. Today, we usually ask a heating system to make separate bedrooms, hallways, bathrooms, and living spaces stay within a narrow temperature range. In a one-room mountain house, the standard could be completely different. The hearth might be hot enough to make the nearest chair uncomfortable, while the wall across the room stayed cold. The floor could feel colder still. Warmth was a gradient, and the fireplace itself was not especially efficient by modern standards. An open fireplace gives off radiant heat, which is why standing in front of one feels warm so quickly. But it also needs air for combustion, and the rising hot gases pull room air up the chimney. Modern technical studies of fireplaces have measured how large that airflow can be, and note that an open fireplace may lose substantial heated room air through the chimney. The old hearth solved one problem while constantly creating another. It warmed you from the front while helping draw cold replacement air into the building through cracks and gaps. That makes the walls more interesting. Log construction lasted unusually long in parts of Appalachia. Historical surveys in eastern Kentucky note that timber was abundant. Sawmills could be hard to reach, and neighbors or relatives could trade labor to raise a small log house quickly. A 1934 Federal Farm Housing Survey cited in one National Register study found log construction much more common in Kentucky's Appalachian region than in the state as a whole. But stacked logs do not meet perfectly. Between them are irregular spaces, and those spaces matter when cold air is being pulled toward a fireplace. Builders and occupants filled the joints with chinking and daubing, Historic preservation records from western North Carolina specifically distinguish older mud daubing from later replacement materials, such as concrete chinking. In other words, sealing the wall was not a one-time miracle performed when the cabin was raised. The material between logs could crack, wash out, loosen, and require attention. Now imagine the physics from inside, without turning it into a science lecture. The fire is pulling, the chimney is pulling, outside air is looking for a way in. Every bad joint between two logs becomes a tiny doorway for winter. So a patch of clay and filler pressed into a gap is doing more than making the wall look finished. It is cutting down one of the routes by which the house replaces the warm air escaping overhead. This is where the romantic image starts to change. The cabin did not defeat winter with one brilliant invention. It used layers of imperfect solutions. The room was small, the ceiling could be low, the fire stayed close to the people, the wall gaps were packed, doors and openings were limited, clothing and bedding handled the last distance between the room is cold and the body can sleep. And there was another advantage to a small house that modern heating makes easy to overlook. Bodies themselves give off heat. A family gathered into one compact room adds a little warmth to the same air the fire is already heating. It is not enough to replace the hearth, of course, but it works in the same direction. More important, people are sharing the warmest zone rather than spreading themselves across a large building. That also explains why enlarging a house could change the heating problem. Appalachian log houses often grew over time. A single pen might gain another room, a rear addition, or evolve into forms such as the saddlebag house, where two pens were arranged around a chimney. Historical surveys in western North Carolina and eastern Kentucky show this kind of gradual expansion clearly. More space meant more comfort in one sense, but it also meant more space that heat had to reach. So the first answer to our title is not big fireplace, and it is not thick logs. It is heat discipline. Before furnaces and thermostats, staying warm began by deciding what actually needed to be warm. Not the whole structure, not every cubic foot of air. First, the hearth zone, then the people, then the bed. Everything else could be colder. And once you see the cabin that way, the next problem becomes unavoidable. A household could build the smallest room, seal every visible crack, and crowd close to the fire, but none of it worked without a steady supply of dry fuel. In the mountains, that meant the heating system began long before winter. Out in the woods, with an axe. And that axe was only the beginning. A cabin could be built once and repaired when needed. Firewood had to be produced again and again. Every cold season consumed part of the forest in a very literal way, one armload at a time. In the southern Appalachians, where timber was abundant, families had access to an enormous fuel supply, compared with people living in more heavily cleared or urban places. But a tree standing on a slope was not yet heat. Someone still had to bring it down, cut it into usable lengths. Split what needed splitting, move it close to the house, and keep enough of it dry to burn when the weather turned bad. The National Park Service describes early southern Appalachian settlers working within a vast forest where wood supplied homes, fencing, shingles, and fuel. That chain of work explains why wood heat shaped the calendar. You did not want to begin thinking seriously about fuel after snow was already on the ground. Freshly cut wood contains water, sometimes a great deal of it, and part of the fire's energy is spent driving that moisture away before the wood can give useful heat to the room. Forest Service research on wood fuel makes the basic point clearly. Moisture reduces the amount of usable heat you get from a pound of fuel. Dry wood burns more effectively, while green wood makes the heating job harder. For a mountain household, that scientific fact showed up as an ordinary annoyance. Wet wood could be stubborn to light. It could hiss. It could smoke. It could leave you feeding a fire that seemed busy without making the room as comfortable as you wanted. So cutting ahead mattered. Wood stacked where air could move around it had time to lose moisture before it was needed most. The exact fuel mix depended on what grew nearby and what a family had available. Appalachian forests offered many hardwoods, and species such as oak and hickory were valuable because dense wood could provide a long, steady burn. But people did not live by a neat modern chart ranking firewood species. Availability mattered, so did the size of the piece, how dry it was, what the fire was being asked to do, and how much labor stood between the tree and the hearth. Forest Products laboratory material, for example, notes the steady heating character associated with oak. That last part is easy to underestimate. Great Smoky Mountains National Park uses old tools in its mountain life programs to explain the work behind historic log homes. The list includes axes, crosscut saws, mauls, draw knives, and other hand tools. A crosscut saw could turn a trunk into shorter sections. A maul and wedges could help break large pieces apart. None of those tools had an engine. The energy came from shoulders, backs, hands, and time. Now put the cabin on a mountain farm rather than on a museum lawn. The useful tree may not be beside the door. The ground may be uneven. A cut section of hardwood is heavy. Split pieces still have to be gathered and carried or hauled. Then the same process starts again because an open hearth can consume fuel rapidly. The fireplace is heating the room, heating cooking vessels, and sending hot gases up the chimney at the same time. What looks like a pile of logs beside the wall is really stored labor. This also changes the meaning of a winter woodpile. Today, stacked firewood can look decorative. For a household relying on it, the pile was closer to a fuel tank with no delivery truck coming. Its size represented how much heating capacity remained. A long cold spell did not simply make the family uncomfortable, it increased the rate at which that stored work disappeared. And there was no perfect way to predict the season. If the household cut too little, someone eventually had to go back out and find more. If the available wood was green or wet, the fire became less cooperative. If snow or rain made hauling difficult, the distance between the woods and the hearth suddenly mattered more. A heating system based on local fuel was wonderfully independent in one sense, but it demanded constant physical participation. The work did not end when the wood reached the cabin. Different stages of the fire called for different material. Small dry pieces and kindling helped establish flame. Larger pieces could maintain heat longer. Cooking might require something more controlled than simply making the biggest possible blaze. Coals mattered because a bed of hot embers could provide steadier heat and make it easier to bring the fire back after the flames had dropped. That mattered especially overnight. Keeping an open fireplace roaring until morning would consume a great deal of wood and demand attention. Letting it die completely created another problem. The first person awake faced a cold room and the job of rebuilding heat. So households benefited from preserving coals when they could. Ash can slow the loss of heat from buried embers, and a surviving coal gives the next fire a head start. The morning task becomes less about creating fire from nothing and more about finding what survived. Adding dry fuel, and coaxing the hearth back into useful life. But even this had limits. Fire was not a tame appliance sitting safely behind a sealed metal door. Historic mountain houses used large stone or brick chimneys and hearths because combustion needed a place that could tolerate intense heat. The same MPS material describing southern Appalachian homes notes that stone was used for foundations and chimneys, and that families both warmed themselves and cooked at the fireplace. Sparks could escape, creosote and soot could accumulate in chimneys, wood stored too close to flame was dangerous, clothing, bedding, wooden floors, and walls all gave the household reasons to respect the same fire it depended on. The center of warmth was also one of the clearest ways to lose the house. So tending the hearth was partly heating and partly risk management. You can picture the routine without inventing a dramatic scene. Someone brings in fuel before it is needed. Smaller pieces stay accessible. Ash has to be managed. The fire is adjusted for cooking, then for evening warmth, before sleep. The household has to decide how much fuel to leave burning and how much attention the fire can safely receive during the night. In the morning, the whole system begins again. That cycle helps explain why the woodshed, woodpile, axe, saw, and fireplace belong to the same heating system. Remove any one of them and the cabin becomes harder to warm. The forest was the energy source. Human labor was the machinery. The woodpile was storage. The hearth was the final converter. And because so much work went into making heat, families had a strong reason not to waste it. The next layer of Appalachian winter survival was therefore not about producing more fire at all. It was about stopping cold air from stealing the heat they had already worked so hard to make. If the woodpile was stored labor, every crack in the cabin was a tiny leak in that labor. This is the part of old mountain heating that is easy to miss, because a fireplace is dramatic and a wall gap is not. Flames move, coals glow, a chimney dominates the room. Chinking looks like mud pressed between logs, but on a cold night, that strip of material could determine whether the heat you had spent all day creating stayed near the family or disappeared into a steady current of outside air. The problem began with the logs themselves. Even carefully hewn logs were not perfectly straight. Identical blocks, stack one on another, and irregular spaces remain. In many log buildings, those spaces were filled with chinking and daubing. The National Park Service describes chinking as a mixture that could include clay, sand, lime, silt, ash, and dirt, packed between the logs to seal the structure. Besides helping keep water out of the joints, that seal provided a measure of temperature control. That sounds modest, but imagine removing it. Outside air can now push directly through the wall. The fireplace is drawing air up the chimney, so replacement air has to enter somewhere. If the cabin has loose joints around logs, a poorly fitted door, open cracks near the floor, or an uncovered window opening, winter air uses those paths. You can build a larger fire, but the larger fire can increase the draft up the chimney, and the cycle continues. So one of the cheapest ways to feel warmer was not to produce more heat. It was to slow the leak. This meant the wall itself required maintenance. Chinking could crack, daubing could loosen, weather could damage it. A gap that seemed minor in mild weather became more important when cold wind pressed against the cabin. Repairing those joints was therefore part of the heating system, even though no flame was involved. And the walls were only one part of the shell. Doors mattered because an early cabin door was not a modern insulated slab with factory weather stripping. Historic log houses preserve simple board doors, and surviving structures often show how limited the number of openings could be. The fewer large holes you cut into a wall, the fewer places you create for cold air and heat exchange. Some old cabins had only a small number of windows, and the National Park Service notes that certain historic cabins use shutters where later houses might have glass. The Matthews cabin on the Blue Ridge Parkway, for example, is specifically described as having glass windows as a comparatively nicer feature, setting it apart from many houses of its period. That one detail changes the picture. A window is useful for light, but every opening complicates the wall. Before inexpensive glass became ordinary in remote homes, a shutter could close an opening at night or in bad weather. Shut it, and you lose daylight but gain a more solid barrier. Open it, and the room becomes brighter but more exposed. The house was constantly balancing light, smoke, ventilation, and heat. The floor could create another cold boundary. Not every cabin floor was a smooth layer sealed over a modern foundation. Some early buildings used thick puncheon floors made from split or hewn logs. One National Register description of an early mountain cabin notes a heavy puncheon floor, a one-room interior, a loft, and a stick-and-mud chimney. In other surviving buildings, the house itself may stand on stone piers rather than over a tightly enclosed basement. That means cold air can exist beneath the occupied room. Even if the fire raises the temperature around your shoulders, your feet may still be close to a cold floor. Heat rises, gaps leak, and the lower part of the room can remain uncomfortable. This is one reason the phrase, "the cabin was warm," can be misleading. Warm where? At what height? At what distance from the hearth? A chair near the fire may feel pleasant. 3 steps away may feel cool. The bed against a wall may feel colder still. And this is where people themselves became part of the architecture. Instead of expecting the entire room to become uniformly warm, families could create smaller layers of protection around the body. Wool clothing, multiple garments, quilts, blankets, feather beds where available, and shared sleeping spaces reduced the amount of heat that had to be supplied by the room itself. The cabin might only need to remain survivable while bedding created the warmer microclimate that actually carried a person through the night. Think of it as heating in nested circles. The forest supplies the wood. The hearth warms one zone of the room. The walls and chinking slow the outside air. The clothing protects the person. The bed traps another layer of warmth around the sleeper. Each layer is imperfect. Together, they make the system work. Furniture placement could follow the same logic. You would not deliberately put the most important winter activity in the coldest corner if the hearth side of the room was available. Cooking already centered people near the fire. Evening work could happen there too. Children, adults, tools, food preparation, conversation and household tasks all tended to benefit from being in the useful heat zone, rather than treating the room as if every square foot were equal. This creates a very different idea of comfort. Modern heating encourages us to heat space first and let people move freely inside it. Older cabin life often worked in reverse. People moved themselves toward the heat. They adjusted clothing, they closed openings, they repaired cracks, they used bedding as insulation. The body followed the warm zone instead of demanding that the warm zone follow the body. There was also an important trade-off. Sealing a house too tightly around an open fire was not the goal. Combustion needs air. Smoke has to rise properly. Cooking creates moisture and odors. A working hearth is not something you place inside an airtight box. The aim was not perfect sealing. It was controlling the worst drafts while still allowing the fireplace and chimney to function. That distinction matters because historic cabins were not passive, self-regulating systems. They required constant judgment. A shutter might be opened for light. A door opens and dumps in cold air. A wall joint needs patching. Wet clothing needs drying near the fire. Smoke may force a change in airflow. A child moves closer to the hearth. Someone adds another log. The cabin is being adjusted all day. And once darkness came, another thermal problem became more important than the walls, floor, or door. The fire would weaken. People would stop moving. Hours would pass before morning. That made the bed one of the most important pieces of winter technology in the entire house, because the hardest part of staying warm was not always sitting beside the flames. It was surviving the long stretch when everyone finally went to sleep. The cabin might have been tolerable while everyone was awake. Night was different. As the evening fire settled, people stopped walking, cooking, hauling wood, and working close to the hearth. The room began to lose the little extra heat produced by movement and flame. Outside, the cold had hours to work on the walls, floor, roof, and door. Inside, a sleeping person needed warmth while doing almost nothing to create it. That is why the bed deserves to be treated as part of the heating system. Historic mountain homes in the southern Appalachians often concentrated family life in very small spaces, and surviving one-room cabins show how little separation there could be between hearth, work area, storage, and sleeping space. Historic documentation also records small cabins with lofts, allowing sleeping space to be stacked above the main room rather than spread across several heated bedrooms. The sleeping problem was therefore solved less by warming a separate room and more by protecting the sleeper from the room. The simplest layer was clothing. Going to bed did not require the kind of light sleepwear a centrally heated house makes comfortable today. On a bitter night, additional dry layers could reduce the amount of heat leaving the body. Wool was particularly useful because its fibers trap air, and several layers create small, insulating spaces close to the skin. The principle was the same one families had used all day. Do not spend precious fuel heating air you do not need to heat. Keep the warmth close to the person. Then came the bed itself. Feather beds were certainly present in early American households and appear in historical documentation connected with homes in the Appalachian South, A National Park Service study of the John Ross House, for example, specifically discusses a featherbed among the furnishings associated with the property. Feathers are useful not because they generate heat, but because a deep mass of them traps air. Once warmed by the body, that trapped air slows the transfer of heat into the colder surroundings. Suddenly the bed becomes something more than furniture. It becomes insulation underneath you. Not every family owned the same bedding, of course, and not every Appalachian household had the same resources. That distinction is important. Appalachia covered many communities, economic circumstances, and generations. Some households could have substantial feather bedding. Others depended more heavily on simpler mattresses, blankets, quilts, coverlets, or combinations of whatever materials could be made, inherited, purchased, or repaired. There was no single universal Appalachian winter bed, but the strategy remained the same. Build insulation around the body instead of trying to make every board in the cabin warm. Quilts fit that strategy beautifully. A quilt combines layers of fabric with material between them. Those layers slow heat loss by trapping small pockets of air, and unlike the cabin wall, a quilt moves with you. It can be folded, doubled, tucked around feet, shared, repaired, added to when the temperature drops. Think about what that means inside a freezing room. The logs are the outer wall. The bedding becomes the inner wall. And your body sits in the tiny protected space between them. Now imagine climbing into that bed before it has absorbed any body heat. The mattress is cold. The blankets are cold. The sheets are cold. For the first few minutes, your own body has to warm the small pocket beneath the covers, while the bedding gradually begins to slow the escape of that heat. That unpleasant moment also explains why people in pre-modern homes sometimes warmed beds before climbing into them. Historic collections preserve purpose-built bed warmers, long-handled metal pans designed to carry heat beneath cold bedding. The Smithsonian categorizes surviving examples specifically as objects for bedroom heating, and National Park Service furnishing records also document warming pans used in historic American homes. The idea was wonderfully direct. Do not heat the bedroom, heat the bed. A warming pan could move heat from the hearth directly into the blankets before someone lay down. That does not mean every poor mountain household owned one. A purpose-built metal object cost money, and material culture varied enormously from home to home. But the principle tells us something important about heating before modern furnaces. Make the target smaller. You do not need to warm thousands of cubic feet of air if you can warm the few cubic feet surrounding a sleeping body. And if more than one person occupied that little space, the system worked even better. Shared beds were practical wherever furniture and room were limited. Spouses shared beds, and children could sleep together. Every human body releases heat. Put several bodies beneath the same insulating layers, and they contribute warmth to the same tiny enclosed environment. Again, the room itself does not become warm. The people do. Bed placement could help too. A sleeping place beside a strong draft or a poorly sealed opening would lose heat faster. In cabins with lofts, sleeping above the main floor could sometimes place occupants where warmer indoor air naturally collected. Historic records of early cabins in the region document one-room plans with loft spaces, showing how vertical space allowed a small structure to perform several jobs at once. But sleeping above or near a hearth created another problem. Fire had to be respected. The same flames keeping the household alive were surrounded by wooden walls, wooden floors, wooden furniture, dry clothing and bedding. A household could not simply make the largest possible blaze and ignore it until morning. Warmth and safety pulled in opposite directions. You wanted enough heat to make the night manageable. You wanted useful embers left for morning. You wanted the chimney drawing properly. But you did not want sparks escaping into the room or an uncontrolled fire burning while everyone slept. So bedtime became a compromise. The fire weakened. The bedding took over. And the acceptable temperature of the room dropped. This is where an old cabin becomes almost impossible to understand if we judge it by modern indoor comfort. Today, we often heat the bedroom first and use a blanket to make ourselves slightly more comfortable. The mountain cabin could work almost backward. The room might remain genuinely cold while the bed became the warm environment. Your face could feel winter air. Your nose could feel cold. The floor beyond the covers could be miserable. But underneath enough insulating layers, your body could maintain a small pocket of warmth through the night. The bed was not sitting inside the comfortable climate. The bed was the comfortable climate. And eventually someone had to leave it. Before breakfast, before morning chores, before the cabin became active again, one person had to push back the covers and step into that colder world. Feet reached the floor. The hearth was checked. Ash was moved. Surviving embers were uncovered. Kindling went down. Dry wood followed. Air reached the coals. And slowly the centre of the cabin came alive again. For generations, that cycle defined winter mornings. Then a different piece of technology began appearing more widely in mountain homes. It still burned wood. It still required cutting, splitting, carrying, drying, and tending fuel. But instead of exposing the fire directly to the room, it trapped combustion inside iron. And that simple change allowed families to squeeze far more useful warmth from the same basic pile of wood. The next major step in Appalachian heating was the wood stove. The wood stove did not eliminate the old heating problem. It changed the terms of it. An open hearth gives you visible flame, direct radiant heat, and a place to cook. But it also sends a large stream of hot air and combustion gases up a wide chimney. A stove encloses the fire inside iron. That metal becomes hot, then radiates and transfers heat into the room from a much larger controlled surface. At the same time, the stove can regulate airflow more tightly than an open fireplace. The result is simple. More of the energy in each stick of wood can stay useful inside the house. For an Appalachian family, that mattered because every improvement in fuel efficiency reduced something else. Time with an axe, trips to the woodpile, the amount of timber consumed, or the number of times someone had to get up and feed the fire. But the arrival of stoves was gradual. Remote mountain households did not all abandon fireplaces at once. Cast iron stoves cost money. They had to be manufactured, transported, purchased, and installed. A family far from a town or good road could continue using an older hearth long after metal stoves were common somewhere else. In many homes, the fireplace remained important for cooking or backup even after a stove appeared. So instead of imagining one sudden technological revolution, picture overlap. One cabin still depends on a stone hearth. Another has a small iron heating stove. Another uses a cook stove that now serves both the meal and the room. Another still has a fireplace, but has begun rearranging the house around newer heating equipment. The basic fuel may still be oak, hickory, maple, chestnut, or whatever dry wood is available. The forest has not disappeared from the system. Human labour has not disappeared either. But the fire itself has moved inside a box. That box changes the way the family can control combustion. With an open fireplace, the fire is exposed to a large volume of room air. With a stove, doors, dampers, and a smaller flue can restrict the amount of oxygen feeding the fire. Reduce the airflow and the wood can burn more slowly. Increase it and the fire grows hotter. The exact control depends on the stove, but the household has far more ability to stretch a load of fuel across time. That becomes important at night. Remember the earlier problem? A roaring open fire is warm, but it consumes fuel quickly and cannot be left carelessly while everyone sleeps. A stove still demands caution, yet a controlled bed of coals inside iron can hold useful heat longer. Instead of watching open flames collapse into ash, the household can often reduce the draft and encourage a slower burn. That does not mean the stove stays hot until morning without attention. Some nights it may not. Cold weather, stove size, fuel quality, chimney draft, and the amount of wood loaded all matter. But compared with an open hearth, the family has gained another tool for moving heat across the longest part of the night. The stove also changes where warmth appears in the room. Stand beside an open fireplace and much of what you feel is radiant energy coming from one direction. Turn your back and you immediately notice the difference. A hot iron stove radiates from several surfaces. Its sides heat, its top heats, its front heats. Air moving around that iron warms and rises, helping create more circulation through the room. The result can feel less like standing in front of a campfire and more like being near a hot object that is heating the surrounding space continuously. That sounds closer to modern heating, but the difference remains enormous. There is still no thermostat. There is still no fan pushing equal amounts of warm air into every room. There is still no automatic fuel supply. The stove is hottest immediately after fresh fuel catches and gradually cools as the burn declines. A person still has to read the fire, judge the wood, adjust the draft, and decide when another piece should go in. Temperature moves in waves. Hotter after tending, cooler before the next load, hotter again. A family learns the rhythm rather than setting a number on a wall. The stove also allowed a different kind of household efficiency when it became part of cooking. A cook stove could turn one fire into several simultaneous jobs. Its firebox supplied heat. Its iron top held pots and pans. An oven captured heat for baking. Water could be warmed nearby. Wet gloves or small items could dry at a safe distance. Food, heat, hot water, and drying all clustered around the same fuel source. In a household where wood represented hours of physical labour, combining those jobs made practical sense. And because the stove was smaller than a large open hearth, it could sometimes influence how rooms were arranged. A stovepipe could carry hot gases toward a chimney while radiating some additional heat along the way. In houses with more than one room, families sometimes tried to let warmth move through doors, stair openings, or interior spaces rather than installing an independent heater everywhere. But once again, this did not mean the whole house became equally warm. The room containing the stove might be comfortable. A neighbouring room might be cool. A loft or upstairs area might benefit from rising warm air. A distant bedroom might remain cold enough that bedding still mattered more than the room temperature. So the older strategy did not vanish when the stove arrived. It became layered with new technology. People still closed doors. They still sealed drafts. They still used quilts. They still gathered near the warmest room. They still planned fuel months ahead. They still judged winter by the shrinking wood pile. What changed was the amount of useful heat they could squeeze from each load. And there was another improvement hidden inside that iron box: smoke control. An open fireplace can spill smoke into a room when the chimney draws poorly, when wind pressures change, or when a cold flue has not begun pulling strongly upward. A properly installed stove directs combustion gases more deliberately into a stovepipe and chimney. That can make the room cleaner and easier to live in. But it also introduces new hazards. The iron becomes hot enough to burn skin or ignite nearby material. A stovepipe can overheat. Creosote can collect in a chimney or flue. A poorly protected wall or floor can catch fire. Too little ventilation can create dangerous indoor air conditions. So the new device was not a safe appliance in the modern sense. It was a more controllable fire, and control had to be learned. Children had to stay clear. Wood had to be stacked close enough for convenience, but far enough for safety. Ash had to be removed. Chimneys still had to be watched. A stove could improve winter life dramatically while remaining one of the most dangerous objects in the house. That combination, comfort and danger in the same piece of iron, became part of mountain life for generations. But whether a family used an open hearth or a stove, one problem remained stubbornly outside the firebox. Heat rises. And in a small cabin, The space above your head could either help preserve warmth or quietly carry it away through the roof. That leads us to one of the least dramatic but most important parts of the entire winter system: the ceiling. The loft and the roof directly above them. The ceiling was not just the top of the room. In a small Appalachian cabin, it could decide where a surprising amount of useful warmth ended up. Warm air naturally rises, so heat produced near the hearth tends to move upward through a building unless something stops it. Historic surveys of Appalachian log buildings repeatedly document 1.5-story houses and loft rooms, sometimes opened directly to the underside of the roof. One National Register record describes a 1-story cabin with a loft beneath a gabled roof originally covered with hand-split wooden shingles. That arrangement created both an opportunity and a weakness. The opportunity was simple. If you needed somewhere to sleep, moving upward could put you closer to some of the warmest air in the house without burning another stick of wood. A loft did not need its own fireplace. It did not need another chimney. It could borrow part of the heat already rising from the room below. Imagine a family gathered around the hearth in the evening. The fire warms people directly, but it also warms the surrounding air. That air rises past the lower room and moves toward the rafters. Anyone sleeping above the main floor may benefit from that upward movement. The basic physics is ordinary convection. Warmer air becomes less dense and tends to rise, carrying heat upward with it. But now, look one step higher. Above the loft is the roof, and early cabin roofs were nothing like the thick, insulated assemblies used on modern houses. Historic Appalachian structures preserve evidence of hand-split wooden shingles laid over relatively simple roof framing. National Register documentation describes mountain cabins with roofs originally covered in split wooden shingles, while surviving loft spaces sometimes still retain evidence of those earlier roof materials. Wood shingles can keep weather outside when properly made and maintained. They do not perform like a modern insulated attic. And insulation matters because it slows the movement of heat through the building's shell. Without a substantial insulating layer between the occupied space and the roof, heat reaching the upper part of the cabin has an easier path toward the cold exterior. So the loft could create a strange winter compromise. You gain warmth because you are above the main room, but you move closer to the cold roof. The air around you might be warmer than the air near the floor, while the boards overhead remain brutally cold. And once again, the cabin does not solve winter with one perfect feature. It stacks imperfect solutions. Move upward, and you benefit from rising heat. Use thick bedding, and you keep that warmth close to the body. Keep the house small, and the fire has less interior space to influence. Maintain the roof, and you prevent another source of cold misery from entering. Nothing works alone. The roof had another job that mattered just as much as warmth. It had to keep the interior dry. Imagine even a minor leak over the sleeping area during cold weather. Now a blanket becomes damp. A piece of clothing stays wet. Water reaches the floor. Stored material in the loft absorbs moisture. The family has not merely acquired an inconvenience, they have created another problem the fireplace must help solve because drying those things requires heat. So roof maintenance belonged to winter preparation, even though a roof produced no heat of its own. A missing or damaged wooden shingle mattered. A leak mattered. A loose section mattered. The best woodpile in the valley could not make a wet bed pleasant. And beneath that roof, the loft could do much more than hold sleepers. In a tiny house, vertical space was valuable. A one-room plan gives you limited floor area, while an upper level adds useful space without requiring another large heated room beside the first one. Historic Appalachian log houses include single pen forms as well as houses enlarged into two-pen arrangements. One documented Kentucky example consists of two hand-hewn log pens beneath a common wooden shingle roof, with the older section rising a story and a half. That is a useful winter arrangement even if nobody described it in scientific terms. Build upward instead of spreading everything outward. The fire below is already burning. The warm air is already moving upward. The loft occupies some of the space that heat passes through, but there was always a limit to what the loft could borrow. If the fire weakened, the supply of new heat weakened with it. If outside wind increased leakage through gaps high in the structure, warm air could escape faster. If the roof lacked insulation, heat continued moving outward through the upper shell. Modern building research shows the same underlying behaviour clearly. Warm indoor air can rise toward an attic, while gaps and poorly insulated upper surfaces become routes for heat loss. This helps explain why one cabin could contain several different climates at the same time. Near the fireplace, your face might feel almost too hot. Move away from it and the air cools. Near the floor, your feet may feel the cold coming through or beneath the boards. Climb into a loft and the air can feel milder again. Then stretch your hand toward the roof and you are suddenly close to the cold exterior shell. There is no single cabin temperature. There is a map of temperatures, and people living there would learn that map. You know which corner catches a draft. You know which place near the hearth becomes uncomfortable when the fire is strong. You know whether the loft remains tolerable after midnight. You know which child needs another quilt. You know where wet socks will actually dry. You know which side of the room becomes cold first when the fire begins to fade. The building teaches you through repetition. Night after night, winter after winter. That knowledge becomes part of survival without ever needing to be written down. And the upper structure could change that map quickly. Warm air moving toward the roof creates pressure differences that can drive air through cracks and openings. Modern weatherization science describes this upward movement and the resulting heat loss as part of the stack effect. In a simple historic structure, every poorly sealed upper joint gives that rising warmth another possible escape route. So maintenance was not cosmetic. Repairing a gap protected fuel. Fixing a roof protected bedding. Closing an unwanted opening slowed air movement. Every improvement defended heat that someone had already worked to produce. And the cabin kept asking the same question in different forms. How little of that heat can we afford to lose? But there was one place where letting hot air escape was unavoidable. The chimney. A wood fire cannot keep burning safely inside a living space unless smoke and combustion gases have a reliable path outside. That means part of the energy produced by the fire is deliberately carried away with the exhaust. Even modern heating guidance recognizes chimney losses as a fundamental consequence of combustion systems that vent outdoors. And in older mountain homes, the chimney could be one of the most imposing pieces of the entire cabin. Stone, brick, and in some early structures, much more primitive combinations of timber framing and clay. It controlled smoke. It affected draft. It determined how the fire burned. It carried heat out of the house. And if something went wrong, it could turn the heating system into a structure fire. So the next part of the cabin we need to understand is the one deliberately designed to let some of its precious warmth disappear. The chimney. The chimney was supposed to let heat escape. That sounds like a design flaw until you remember what the alternative was. A wood fire produces smoke, hot gases, ash, sparks, and combustion products that cannot remain in the room with the family. The chimney gives those gases a controlled path upward and outside, but every column of hot exhaust leaving the roof also carries energy with it. So the Appalachian household faced a strange bargain. The same passage that made an indoor fire possible also guaranteed that some of the fire's heat would be lost. And that passage had to work correctly. A chimney depends on draft. Hot gases inside the flue rise because they are less dense than the colder air around them. As they rise, they help pull fresh air toward the fire. When the chimney is warm and drawing well, smoke moves toward the opening, up the flue and out. When the draft is weak, smoke can hesitate, curl into the room, or spill from the fireplace. That is why starting a fire in a cold chimney can feel different from tending one that has been burning for hours. The entire vertical system has to come alive. Historic Appalachian buildings show how physically important the chimney could be. National Register documentation for surviving mountain houses describes large exterior stone chimneys as dominant architectural features, and some early log structures devoted a remarkable amount of space to a massive fireplace and chimney mass. In one documented early log house, the stone chimney and open fireplace occupied nearly a quarter of the available living area. That was not wasted space. A large hearth had to contain flame, support cooking, handle heavy fuel, and connect safely to a flue capable of carrying smoke away. Stone and brick also tolerated heat far better than the surrounding timber walls. In a house built largely from combustible material, the chimney created a small mineral core around one of the most dangerous activities of daily life. But not every early chimney was a massive stone structure. In frontier construction, especially where time, money, masonry skill, or suitable material was limited, some households used what became known as stick and mud chimneys. These were built from a wooden framework coated with clay or mud, rather than formed entirely from stone or brick. National Park Service historical records preserve descriptions of such chimneys in older vernacular dwellings. Think about the contradiction. You are building a passage for smoke and sparks out of wood. The protective layer is mud. If that coating cracks, dries, falls away, or leaves timber exposed to enough heat, the chimney itself can become fuel. That risk helps explain why durable stone and brick chimneys were such valuable improvements when a household could build them. They were not simply attractive masonry attached to the outside of a cabin. They separated extreme heat from a wooden structure that could disappear in a single uncontrolled fire. Even a stone chimney, however, did not remove danger. Wood smoke contains particles and vapors that can condense on cooler chimney surfaces. Over time, combustible deposits such as creosote can accumulate. If those deposits ignite, temperatures inside the flue can rise dramatically. Sparks can also leave an open hearth and land on floors, furniture, clothing, stored material, or bedding. So the fireplace demanded attention even when it seemed to be behaving perfectly. A family had to live close enough to the fire to depend on it while never forgetting what it could do. That created a very physical style of awareness. You notice how the smoke moves when a new log is added. You notice whether the fire suddenly burns harder when the door opens. You notice where the wind outside changes the draft. You notice a strange smell. You notice sparks. You notice a section of chimney that needs repair. You notice because ignoring the system can cost the entire house. The outside position of many large chimneys also affected heat in another way. A chimney built mostly beyond the exterior wall exposes much of its masonry to outdoor cold. Before the flue warms, that cold mass can make establishing a strong draft more difficult. Once heated, however, the chimney has a rising column of hot gases helping pull the fire. An interior chimney keeps more of its masonry within the building envelope and can release some stored warmth inward. But it also consumes valuable floor space and places more heated masonry within the wooden structure. There was no free answer. Every arrangement traded something. Space, heat, materials, labor, fire safety, draft. And that is the pattern we keep finding in the mountain cabin. The walls are not perfect insulation. They are manageable walls. The fireplace is not efficient. It is available heat. The chimney does not preserve every bit of warmth. It makes indoor combustion survivable. The family does not keep every room comfortable. It concentrates comfort where it matters. Even smoke could become a signal about whether the system was working. If a fireplace repeatedly filled the room with smoke, the problem might involve the chimney, wind, an obstruction, the shape of the opening, or the pressure inside the house. The solution was not simply to tolerate unlimited smoke because old cabins were smoky. People who relied on hearths had powerful reasons to make them draw, as well as their materials and construction allowed. A poor fire was irritating. A poor chimney could make ordinary indoor life miserable. And the chimney remained part of the house long after the open hearth began losing ground to iron stoves. The connection changed. Instead of a broad fireplace opening accepting flame and smoke directly, a stove sent its exhaust through a much smaller pipe toward a flue. The fire was enclosed, airflow could be restricted. More heat stayed around the stove before the gases escaped. Yet the same basic requirement remained. Combustion products still needed a reliable path outdoors. Historic structures in Great Smoky Mountains National Park preserve that long transition. The 19th century Walker Sisters cabin, for example, still retains the fireplace as one of the features the park has restored while preserving the building. And later Appalachian cabin districts contain large numbers of stone, brick, or cobblestone chimneys, even as heating technology changed around them. The chimney therefore tells us something larger about warmth before modern heating. Heat was never just about making fire. It was about controlling movement. Wood moved from forest to pile. Air moved through cracks toward the hearth. Flame moved through fuel. Smoke moved up the chimney. Warm air moved toward the roof. People moved toward the warmest part of the room. Every successful winter depended on directing those movements well enough that the family received useful heat before the energy disappeared outside. And there was one more movement that mattered enormously. Cold air did not only come through walls and doors, it came with people. Every time someone stepped outside to feed animals, carry water, bring in wood, visit an outbuilding, or complete another winter chore, the door opened and part of the cabin's carefully managed warmth escaped. That means the next part of the story is not really about the fireplace at all. It is about the daily battle between the warm room and everything the family still had to do outside it. The door was one of the most expensive things in the cabin. Not because it cost much to build, but because every time it opened in winter, the room paid for it. Cold air pushed in low. Warmer air moved out high. The fire had to replace what was lost. And unlike a modern house, there was no furnace quietly correcting the temperature while everyone went about their day. If the cabin cooled, somebody eventually had to add more wood, stir the coals, or sit closer to the hearth. That made ordinary chores part of the heating problem. Water still had to be carried. Animals still had to be fed. Wood still had to come in. Ash had to go out. Food might be stored in another building. Tools might be kept under a shed. A cow, horse, pig, or chicken did not stop needing attention because the air outside hurt your face. So winter life created a constant movement between two climates. Inside, there was the small managed zone around the fire. Outside, there was the larger cold world that supplied nearly everything the household needed. The challenge was not to avoid leaving the cabin. It was to leave efficiently. That is where clothing became more than personal comfort. It became a way to protect the heating system from the demands of outdoor work. A person who could stay functional outside for longer could complete several chores in one trip instead of repeatedly opening the door. Layers mattered. Wool mattered. Dry socks mattered. Gloves, mittens, caps, shawls, coats, and whatever other garments a household possessed allowed the body to carry some of its own insulation beyond the walls. And when those garments came back inside, they created another problem. Snow melts. Rain wets cloth. Sweat dampens inner layers. Boots bring moisture and mud. A garment that works well outside can become unpleasant if it stays wet, so the hearth also became a drying station. Clothing might be hung or spread near warmth, but not so close that sparks or heat damaged it. Wet mittens had to be ready again. Socks had to dry. Boots needed attention. The heating system was therefore supporting tomorrow's work while it warmed the family tonight. You can see how quickly one fire accumulates responsibilities. It cooks. It heats. It dries. It provides hot water. It protects embers for morning. And it has to recover every time the door opens. This is why the timing of chores mattered. Imagine bringing in one armload of wood, closing the door, sitting down, then remembering the water bucket. The door opens again. Then someone needs something from the smokehouse. Open again. Then the animals need feeding. Open again. Each trip is small, but winter punishes repetition. A more efficient household rhythm groups tasks together. Bring in enough wood before dark. Fill water containers. Check animals while you are already outside. Carry back whatever food or tools will be needed later. Finish the cold work, then close the door and let the interior recover. No thermostat tells you this is efficient. The shrinking wood pile does. The door itself could be managed in simple ways. Keep it shut. Do not stand in it talking. Do not leave it open while deciding what to carry. If wind is pressing against one side of the house, that doorway may feel especially harsh. Even a simple cloth, rug, or other barrier near a troublesome opening can reduce the sensation of direct draft, although households varied widely in what materials they had. The principle is the same one we have seen everywhere else. Stop moving air that does not need to move. And the floor near the door was often where you felt the penalty first. Cold air entering a room tends to settle low, so the stream can spread across the floor while warmer air remains higher. A child sitting low or a person stepping out of bed may experience the room differently from someone standing close to the fire. Again, there is no single indoor temperature. There is a moving pattern. Open the door, and the pattern shifts. Feed the fire, and it shifts again. Sunlight reaches a wall, and another corner changes. Wind rises outside, and a draft appears where it was barely noticeable an hour earlier. People adapted by learning those patterns. They also adapted by changing where they spent time. A winter household had strong incentives to compress activity. Meals happen near the fire. Mending happens near the fire. Conversation happens near the fire. Small handwork happens near the fire. Children are easier to watch near the fire. If part of the cabin is colder and offers no special advantage, there is little reason to occupy it just for the sake of spreading out. Modern houses train us to think in rooms. The bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, the office. Historic cabins often demanded a more flexible logic. One warm zone might perform several of those roles across a single evening. That flexibility saved fuel. It also made people part of one another's winter comfort. Several people sharing a small space contribute body heat. Cooking adds heat. A kettle or pot absorbs energy and releases some of it back into the room. Even the simple fact that everyone is gathered in one place means the same fire is serving several bodies at once. But there is a limit. Crowding also adds moisture. Breathing releases water vapor. Cooking releases more. Wet clothes release still more. In a cold building, that moisture can condense on colder surfaces, so the family cannot treat the cabin as a perfectly sealed container. Some air exchange is unavoidable, and with combustion indoors, ventilation remains essential. This creates another winter balance. Too much uncontrolled air movement steals heat. Too little safe ventilation creates smoke and moisture problems. The goal is not airtightness. The goal is control. And control depends on routine. A door used carelessly wastes heat. A door used deliberately becomes a manageable interruption. A wet coat left in the wrong place stays cold. A wet coat dried near the hearth becomes useful again. An empty wood box at midnight becomes a crisis. A full wood box turns the same night into inconvenience. The difference often comes down to preparation rather than technology. That may be the most important thing about Appalachian winter heating. The cabin itself was only part of the system. The rest lived in habits. Cut wood before the cold. Dry it before burning. Bring enough inside. Patch the walls. Close the shutters. Layer clothing. Warm the bed. Protect the coals. Group the chores. Close the door. Repeat. None of those actions is dramatic by itself. Together, they allow a relatively simple structure to function through weather that would otherwise make it miserable. But winter did not always cooperate with routine. Sometimes the temperature dropped farther than expected. Sometimes wind drove cold through places that were usually tolerable. Sometimes snow blocked travel. Sometimes fuel ran low. Sometimes someone in the household was sick, elderly, very young, or simply unable to tolerate the cold as well as everyone else. That is when ordinary heating became something more serious, because the real test of an Appalachian cabin was not whether it stayed comfortable on a typical winter evening. It was what happened when the system was pushed to its limit. A cabin that worked well on an ordinary winter night could become a very different place when the weather stopped being ordinary. The first warning might be the wind. Cold by itself is one problem. Cold moving through every weakness in the structure is another. The strong winter wind increases pressure against the walls, pushes air through cracks that seemed harmless the day before, and makes the chimney behave differently. The room can begin losing heat faster, even though the fire looks just as large. Then the household has to react. More wood goes on the fire. The shutters stay closed longer. The door opens less often. Outdoor chores are shortened or grouped together. Children and older family members are kept closer to the warmest zone. Extra bedding comes out. The whole cabin tightens around the hearth. This is the moment when all the small decisions from earlier in the season suddenly matter at once. Was enough wood cut? Was it dry? Were the wall gaps repaired? Did the roof leak? Is the chimney drawing properly? Is there enough food close to the house? Did someone remember to bring in water before dark? A cold snap does not create those weaknesses. It reveals them. Fuel is usually the first limit people imagine, and for good reason. If a family has a large supply of dry wood, they can respond to falling temperatures by burning more of it, but that solution is not endless. Firewood is stored labour. A stretch of unusually cold weather makes that stored labour disappear faster than planned. The wood pile shrinks. The pieces closest to the house vanish first. Then someone has to walk farther for the next armload. If snow is deep, the work slows. If the slope is icy, carrying becomes harder. If wind is cutting across the yard, every trip feels longer. And if the available wood is wet, green, or frozen into a pile, the problem becomes worse. A household can still burn imperfect fuel, but it may produce less useful heat for the effort required. More smoke, more tending, less steady warmth. Now add illness. A heating system based on constant human labour assumes that somebody can keep doing the labour. Somebody has to carry wood. Somebody has to tend the fire. Somebody has to haul water. Somebody has to cook. Somebody has to go outside. If one adult becomes sick, the work does not disappear. It falls onto fewer people. That can be especially serious in a household with infants, elderly relatives, or anyone already weakened by illness. People at the extremes of age are less able to tolerate cold stress, and sickness can reduce appetite, movement, and the ability to generate body heat. So the warmest place in the room becomes more valuable. A bed may be moved closer to the hearth. Extra quilts may be added. Hot food and warm liquids become part of comfort. The strongest person may take on more outdoor work, so the vulnerable person can stay inside. The heating strategy changes around the body that needs the most protection. Water creates another hidden pressure. A family might live beside a spring, creek, well, or other local source, but winter can make access more difficult. Ice forms, buckets become awkward, paths become slick, containers left in unheated spaces can freeze. And water is heavy. A gallon weighs more than 8 pounds. Carry several gallons over uneven ground, and the heating problem suddenly connects to physical endurance. Every trip outside cools the person making it. Every open door cools the room. Every wet glove or sleeve has to be dried again. That is why storing enough water inside for the night could be more than convenience. It reduced exposure. The same logic applied to food. If flour, cornmeal, beans, preserved meat, potatoes, apples, or other staples were already within reach, the household could stay close to the fire during the worst weather. But if essential food sat in another building, cellar, crib, smokehouse, or storage area, somebody still had to cross the cold space between structures. Mountain farms were not self-contained cabins. They were systems of separate buildings. The house, the barn, the spring house, the smokehouse, the corn crib, the shed, the privy. Each building had a purpose. Winter turned the distance between them into a cost. Snow added more than cold. It could cover paths, slow travel, hide ice, make wood harder to reach, and isolate a family from neighbours or town. Even a relatively short distance becomes different when roads are poor and travel depends on foot, horse, wagon, or later a simple vehicle not designed for severe conditions. Isolation matters because a failing heating system is easier to survive when help is nearby. A broken chimney, an injured adult, a shortage of dry wood, or a sick child becomes more serious when reaching another household takes hours instead of minutes. This is where neighbours entered the winter system. Rural Appalachian communities often depended heavily on reciprocal labour. People helped raise buildings, harvest crops, butcher animals, and respond to emergencies in severe weather. The same social network could matter as much as a tool or a stack of wood. A neighbour with an axe could become heat. A neighbour with a horse could become transportation. A neighbour with dry firewood could become time. A neighbour with a warmer house could become shelter. The cabin did not stand alone just because it looked isolated. And still, there were nights when all the preparation could only reduce the problem rather than eliminate it. The room might remain cold. Breath might be visible in the morning. Water near an exterior wall might skin over with ice. Clothing hung far from the fire might still feel stiff. The floor might be painful under bare feet. The warm zone could contract until everyone wanted the same few feet around the stove or hearth. At that point, survival becomes less about making the cabin comfortable and more about preventing the body from losing heat faster than it can replace it. Eat. Stay dry. Keep moving when awake. Protect hands and feet. Layer clothing. Share bedding. Feed the fire. Limit unnecessary trips outside. Watch the vulnerable. Those are small actions, but cold weather rewards small actions repeated correctly. And there is another reason extreme cold made the hearth dangerous. When people are desperate for warmth, they are tempted to push the fire harder. More fuel, higher flames, hotter stove, more sparks, a chimney carrying more heat, wooden walls only a few feet away. The colder the night becomes, the stronger the urge to use the very thing that can destroy the house. That is the final cruel balance of old heating. Too little fire can leave a family dangerously cold. Too much uncontrolled fire can leave them with no house at all. So the successful winter household was not the one that made the biggest blaze. It was the one that managed the whole system. Fuel, air, moisture, shelter, clothing, food, labour, fire, people, and when all of those pieces worked together, the small mountain cabin could remain livable through weather that would feel shocking to anyone accustomed to central heating. But there is still one question we have not answered. What did warm actually feel like inside? Not in theory, not in architecture, in the body. Because the lived experience of a heated cabin was far more uneven, smoky, noisy, dry in some places, damp in others, and physically demanding than the cozy image suggests. That is where we go next. The word warm is doing a lot of work when we talk about an Appalachian cabin. If you walked into one on a winter evening, you probably would not experience a single comfortable temperature. You would experience zones. Near the hearth, your face might feel hot enough that you turn slightly away. The front of your legs might warm quickly. Your hands begin to loosen after coming in from outside, but your back can still feel cool because the wall behind you is cold. Move only a few steps away and the sensation changes again. The room is not warm. The fire is warm. And everyone learns where that warmth reaches. This is one of the biggest differences between older, wood-heated homes and modern central heating. Today, we usually heat air throughout a building and expect the temperature to stay reasonably even. In a small cabin heated by an open hearth or simple stove, comfort is much more directional. Radiant heat travels from the hot surface toward your body. You can feel it immediately, even when the surrounding air remains cold. That is why someone sitting close to the fire can feel comfortable, while another person on the opposite side of the room wants another layer. The floor tells the truth fastest. Warm air rises, and cold air tends to remain lower. If the cabin stands above open ground or on stone piers, the boards beneath your feet can stay bitterly cold. Shoes matter. Socks matter. A rug, hide, or any extra material underfoot matters. Getting out of a warm bed before dawn can mean moving from the warmest little environment in the house directly onto one of the coldest surfaces. Then there is the sound. A wood-heated cabin is never completely silent. A log shifts in the fire. Sap pops. Iron ticks as a stove heats or cools. Wind presses against the wall. A loose shutter moves. Someone reaches for another piece of wood. These sounds tell you what the heating system is doing. They are not background decoration. They can be information. A fire that suddenly goes quiet may need attention. A stronger wind can mean more draft. Living with fire makes the household listen to heat. Smell belongs to the experience too. Dry wood has one smell when it enters the room and another when it burns. Smoke may appear briefly when the fire is started or when a door is opened at the wrong moment. Damp wool smells different as it dries. Boots bring mud. Cooking adds fat, corn, beans, meat, coffee, or whatever the household is preparing. All of those smells collect in the same small space because the warm room is also the kitchen, drying room, sitting room, and sometimes sleeping room. That concentration can feel cozy from a distance. Up close, it is physical. Your cheeks can become hot while your feet remain cold. Your clothing can feel stiff when you first come in from outside, then slowly soften as it warms. Snow on a coat becomes water. Water becomes vapor. The fire has to deal with that too. And the temperature never stops moving. Add several pieces of dry wood, and the room begins climbing toward its warmest point. Let the fire settle and the heat weakens. Open the door for a few seconds and cold air spills across the floor. Start cooking, and the area near the hearth becomes hotter. Go to bed, and the whole cabin begins cooling. Wake before dawn, and the fire may be little more than a bed of coals. A thermostat smooths those changes. A wood fire teaches you to live inside them. People respond almost automatically. You move your chair. You put on another layer. You take one off. You pull a child closer. You turn one side of your body toward the heat. You stretch your hands toward the fire, then pull them back. You hang wet clothing where it can dry. You add a log. You wait. Comfort becomes an activity. That may sound exhausting, and sometimes it was, but it also meant that families could tolerate a much wider range of indoor conditions than many of us expect today. The goal was not 70 degrees in every corner. The goal was enough warmth to cook, work, recover from outdoor chores, protect vulnerable family members, and sleep through the night without dangerous cold. That lower expectation changed everything. A room that feels unacceptable to someone accustomed to central heating may still be usable if the person is wearing warm clothing, sitting near radiant heat, eating hot food, and sleeping under heavy bedding. This is why historical descriptions of winter life can sound contradictory. A cabin can be described as warm and still have frost near a window. A hearth can be powerful and the far wall can still feel cold. A person can complain about the cold while sitting only a few feet from a large fire. All of those things can be true at the same time. The body experiences local conditions, not an average number for the whole building. Even seating reflects that fact. The most valuable winter position is not necessarily the largest chair. It is the chair that receives useful heat without receiving too much smoke, sparks, or direct glare. Children may want to crowd closer. Someone doing fine handwork needs enough light as well as warmth. The person tending food needs access to the hearth. The person returning from outside may temporarily get the hottest spot. The room is constantly negotiating who needs heat most. And there is another kind of warmth that matters here. Food. A hot meal does not heat the cabin very much, but it changes how cold feels to the person eating it. Warm liquid, cooked grains, beans, meat, bread, or other calorie-dense food gives the body energy it can use. In a physically demanding winter routine, food and heat are connected because the body itself is one of the machines that has to keep running. The cabin protects the body. The fire protects the cabin. Food fuels the body. Wood fuels the fire. And labor connects all four. That is the lived system. Not a fireplace standing alone. Not a miracle property of logs. Not a romantic blanket of permanent warmth. A chain. When the chain is working, winter becomes manageable. When one link weakens, everyone notices. Wet wood means a weaker fire. A weaker fire means colder clothing. Colder clothing makes outdoor chores harder. Harder chores take longer. Longer trips outside cool the body further. Now the same small problem is spreading through the whole household. That is why experience mattered so much. People who had lived through many winters knew when to cut fuel, where drafts appeared, how much wood a cold night might require, when to bring extra water inside, which bedding was needed, how hard the fire could safely be pushed, and what parts of the house cooled first. The cabin was not automatically warm. It became warm enough because people knew how to operate it. And that brings us to a deeper question. If warmth depended so heavily on skill, labor, fuel, and constant adjustment, then who actually carried all of that work? Because behind every glowing hearth was a daily division of labor that rarely appears in the cozy picture. Someone cut the wood. Someone carried it. Someone cooked over the fire. Someone watched children near the flames. Someone dried clothes, repaired bedding, patched cracks, cleaned ash, and prepared the house before another cold night arrived. To understand how the cabin stayed warm, we have to understand the people who kept it that way. The fire did not tend itself. That sounds almost too obvious to say, but it changes the entire picture of winter life. When we look at an old cabin today, the hearth can feel like a feature of the building. In the household that depended on it, the hearth was an ongoing job. Someone had to notice the fire weakening. Someone had to bring another piece of wood. Someone had to cook while standing close to smoke, heat, iron, and flame. Someone had to keep children from getting too close. Someone had to clean ash, dry wet clothes, prepare bedding, and make sure the household was ready before darkness settled over the farm. And the work was not divided exactly the same way in every family. Age mattered. Health mattered. Season mattered. Whether a household had older children mattered. Whether someone was absent, sick, injured, widowed, or working away from home mattered. But surviving accounts from mountain communities show recognizable patterns. In Catalucci, within what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the National Park Service describes women's time as heavily occupied by raising children, mending clothes, cleaning the house, and cooking meals, while men and boys worked more often with livestock and field crops. That was not an absolute rule, but it gives us a useful picture of how household labor could be organized. Now place that division beside the fireplace. Cooking is heating work. Not because the cook is responsible for warming the entire house, but because cooking requires control of the same fire everyone depends on for warmth. Before a meal can be prepared, the fire has to be usable. Too weak, and the pot takes longer. Too fierce, and food can scorch or the work becomes uncomfortable. Coals may need to be moved. Wood may need to be added. A pot may need to be shifted closer to or farther from the heat. So the person cooking is also constantly reading the hearth. That means domestic work becomes thermal management, almost by accident. While food is being prepared, wet clothing can be drying nearby. Water can be warming. A child can be brought closer to the fire. The next pieces of wood can be positioned where they are ready to use. The room is being operated while the meal is being made. And then there is the bedding. Quilts do not repair themselves. Blankets do not wash themselves. Mattresses do not stay dry by themselves. Clothing tears. Children grow. Cold weather exposes every weakness in the household's fabric supplies. A ripped garment that seems minor in summer can become a real problem when it allows cold air directly against the body. A missing button matters more. Thin socks matter more. A damaged quilt matters more. So sewing and mending belong in the heating story too. They reduce the amount of heat the body loses. This is why staying warm extended far beyond the person who cut the firewood. The axe mattered. So did the needle. The woodpile mattered. So did the quilt. The chimney mattered. So did the meal simmering beside it. A successful winter household depended on all of them. Children were part of that system as well. Historic Smokies households could be large. The National Park Service notes that mid-19th century farm families often lived in homes around 18 by 20 feet, sometimes with a sleeping loft, while families could include grandparents and many children. During cold, wet or snowy periods, large numbers of people might spend most of the day inside that small space. That creates work, but it also creates workers. As children became old enough, they could perform tasks suited to their size and ability. They could carry smaller pieces of wood, fetch an item, help with animals, watch a younger sibling, assist with food preparation, bring in kindling, shake bedding, hold something while an adult repaired it. A child did not suddenly become part of the household economy at adulthood. Responsibility could grow gradually, and in winter, even small jobs saved adult energy. Think about the wood box beside the hearth. Filling it with a full day's supply may require repeated trips outside. A strong adult might split the larger pieces or haul a heavy load from farther away. A younger person might carry in smaller sticks and kindling. The important thing is that fuel keeps moving toward the fire before the fire needs it. That is the hidden rhythm beneath the whole cabin. Work anticipates need. You cut before the wood pile is empty. You mend before the garment fails completely. You bring water before the storm worsens. You feed animals before darkness. You dry clothing before tomorrow's chores. You prepare the bed before everyone is exhausted. You bank or tend the fire before sleep. Winter punishes late decisions. That also meant the labour division could change instantly when something went wrong. If a man normally responsible for heavy outdoor work became injured, somebody else had to get the wood. If the person who normally cooked became sick, somebody else had to manage the hearth and food. If older children left home, the remaining family redistributed chores. If a household consisted mostly of women, women did the work that needed doing. The Walker sisters of Little Greenbrier are a powerful reminder not to turn general patterns into rigid rules. After their parents died and their brothers moved away or married, several of the sisters continued living and working on the family farm in the Smokies for decades, maintaining a mountain household without the conventional adult male labor structure people might casually imagine. Real households adapt. Winter does not care whose job something was supposed to be. The fire only cares where the wood arrives. That may be the clearest way to understand labor inside an Appalachian cabin. Tasks were attached to people, but survival was attached to completion. Someone had to do them, and because the cabin was small, much of that labour happened within sight of everyone else. Cooking, mending, feeding the fire, watching children, preparing clothes, talking, sharpening or repairing a tool, planning tomorrow's work. During long periods of cold weather, families could spend most of the day inside these compact houses, making the heated room not just a place of rest, but the centre of winter production. This is one reason the old cabin could feel crowded and useful at the same time. Every person increased the demands on food, bedding, space and fuel. But every capable person could also contribute labour. The family itself was part of the technology, and beyond the cabin stood another layer of that technology, the community. Because some winter jobs were too large for one person, some emergencies were too serious for one household, some repairs needed extra hands, some families ran short of food, fuel, strength, or time. And, in an isolated mountain settlement, the difference between enduring a bad winter and being overwhelmed by it could sometimes be the people living beyond the next ridge. That is where we go next. A mountain cabin could look lonely from a distance. One house on a slope, smoke rising from the chimney, forest in every direction, another farm hidden beyond a ridge or down a creek. From the outside, it is easy to imagine each household surviving winter almost entirely by itself. But that picture is incomplete. Mountain families often depended on neighbours for the jobs that were too large, too urgent, or too exhausting for one household. In Catalucci, the National Park Service records that major tasks such as corn husking, house raising, barn raising, and making sorghum brought neighbours together. Those gatherings were social, but they were also practical. A community could concentrate many hands on work that would take one family far longer to finish alone. That same logic mattered in winter. A neighbour did not need to own your fireplace to become part of your heating system. They only needed to help with one of the things that kept the fireplace useful: cutting wood, dragging a log, repairing a roof, helping rebuild a damaged chimney, watching children while someone worked outside, carrying food or supplies to a household weakened by illness, giving a family somewhere warmer to stay when their own house became unsafe. None of those actions creates heat directly. All of them can keep a family from losing it. Imagine a man injures his hand late in autumn. The cabin is still standing. The hearth still works. The forest is still full of trees. But the household has just lost some of its ability to turn those trees into fuel. That is where community changes the equation. A brother, cousin, son-in-law, or neighbour may spend a day helping cut and split wood. Several people working together can turn a dangerous fuel shortage into a manageable pile before the weather closes in. The gift is not simply wood. It is wintertime. The same was true for building and repair work. Historic mountain communities were familiar with exchanging labour for large construction jobs. If neighbours could gather to raise a barn or house, the underlying skill was already there. People knew how to work together when one family needed more hands than it possessed. That tradition did not magically disappear when the temperature fell. And winter creates emergencies that reward many hands. A section of roof begins leaking. A chimney is damaged. A tree falls across an access path. Snow makes a route difficult. An animal gets loose. Someone is sick. One person handling the problem may be outside for hours. 4 people may finish before dark. That difference is heat. Because every hour of labour saved outdoors is an hour in which fewer calories are burned, fewer clothes become wet, and fewer trips are made through the cabin door. Community could also reduce isolation in a more basic way. Cataluki residents gathered at post offices and general stores to exchange news and see one another. That tells us these were not families living as separate little islands. Information moved through the valleys along with people. And information can matter during winter. Which road is passable? Who is sick? Who has lost an animal? Who needs help? Who has a tool someone else needs? Who is travelling toward town? Who has heard that worse weather may be coming? Long before a weather app could warn a household, local knowledge gave people another way to prepare. It was imperfect. It could arrive late. It could be wrong. But a neighbour riding in from another part of the valley might know something about conditions that your own cabin could not tell you. That made social contact practical, not ornamental. The same was true of tools. A household did not necessarily need to own every specialised implement if one could be borrowed: an axe, saw, maul, wagon, horse, or repair tool could move between households when needed. Shared access reduced the number of things one family had to purchase or make. Again, that matters for heating because the woodpile sits at the end of a tool chain. No sharp axe, no easy cutting. No saw, no easy bucking of larger timber. No animal or wagon, and hauling may become much harder over distance. The hearth depends on objects that may spend most of the year outside the room. Food support mattered too. Cold weather increases the value of having enough calories available because the body is doing physical work while also trying to maintain temperature. A household short on food may have less strength for cutting, carrying, repairing, and tending. Neighbours and relatives could exchange food, labour, and favours within relationships that lasted for years. Not every exchange was charity. Often it was reciprocity. You help me now. I help you later. You bring hands to my barn raising. I bring hands to yours. You help when my family is sick. I remember when your roof fails. That kind of system works because nobody knows exactly which household will need help next. Winter is very good at changing the answer. And this is why the phrase self-sufficient can be misleading when applied too casually to mountain families. A household might grow much of its food, cut its own fuel, build much of its own shelter, anyway, its own tools, preserve its own meat. Still, that does not mean it functioned alone. Self-reliance and interdependence can exist at the same time. In fact, they often strengthen each other. A capable household has more to offer its neighbours. A strong community gives each capable household a larger safety margin. The Walker sisters are a useful example of how deeply a mountain household could maintain its own routines and work. The National Park Service describes the sisters continuing to farm and live on their family land in the Smokies long after many surrounding residents had left during the creation of the national park. Their story shows remarkable independence. But even that independence existed within a wider human landscape of relatives, visitors, nearby communities, roads, trade, and social contact. Nobody heated a cabin with friendship. But friendship could bring the axe that cut the wood. It could bring the person who knew how to repair the chimney. It could bring food when illness stopped normal work. It could bring news before a storm. It could bring shelter after a fire. And when winter pushed one household past its limit, that network could become the last layer of insulation around the family. So far, we have looked at the heating system from almost every direction. The wood, the walls, the bed, the stove, the roof, the chimney, the daily chores, the people, the neighbours, but one major force was changing all of them at once. Roads improved. Manufactured goods became easier to obtain. Cast iron stoves spread. Sawmilled lumber changed houses. Coal, electricity, and later modern heating technologies began reaching more communities. The old cabin did not disappear overnight. Instead, its heating system slowly entered a long transition. And that transition shows us exactly which parts of the old way people were most eager to leave behind. The old heating system did not vanish because it suddenly stopped working. It vanished because people discovered how exhausting it was once better options became available. That distinction matters. For generations, an Appalachian household could survive winter with wood, a hearth, a tight routine, heavy bedding, and a great deal of labor. The system was proven. It was familiar. It used local fuel. It could keep functioning far from cities, gas lines, or electrical service. But works is not the same as easy. The weaknesses were built into everyday life. Wood had to be cut. Wood had to be hauled. Wood had to be dried. Ash had to be removed. Fires had to be watched. Rooms heated unevenly. Bedrooms stayed cold. Chimneys needed maintenance. Smoke could enter the house. Sparks could start fires. Someone had to wake to a fading fire. Once newer technologies began reducing those tasks, the old system had to compete not only on warmth, but on convenience. Cast iron stoves were one of the first major steps in that direction. They still burned wood, so they did not free families from the forest or the woodpile, but they enclosed the flame, controlled airflow better, and gave households a way to stretch useful heat from the same basic fuel. A stove could also make cooking more controllable than an open hearth, especially when the design included a flat cooking surface and oven. The transition was not from primitive to modern in one jump. It happened by subtraction. First, reduce smoke in the room. Then reduce the amount of wood required. Then hold heat longer. Then make cooking easier. Then distribute warmth more effectively. Each improvement removed one piece of daily hardship. The house itself was changing too. As transportation improved and sawmills became easier to reach, sawn lumber became more available, houses could be framed differently, finished with tighter boards, divided into more specialized rooms, and repaired with manufactured materials instead of relying entirely on what could be produced nearby. That changed heating needs. A larger house offers more privacy and storage, but it also creates more space that must be warmed. The old strategy of one fire serving one compact room becomes less effective as the building expands. So heating technology and house design begin pushing each other forward. Better heaters make larger houses easier to live in. Larger houses create demand for better heaters. Doors connect rooms. Stairways carry warm air upward. Stovepipes extend heat beyond the immediate firebox. Eventually, multiple heating devices may appear in the same house. And not every household changed at the same speed. A family near a town with better roads may gain access to manufactured stoves earlier. A remote family deep in a hollow may keep using an older fireplace for years. A household with more cash can purchase equipment that another family cannot. One generation may remember cooking over an open hearth, while the next grows up around a cook stove. Appalachian modernization was never a single date. It was uneven. Geography made it uneven. Income made it uneven. Roads made it uneven. And electricity made it uneven later still. When electric service eventually reached more rural communities, it changed household energy far beyond heating. Light no longer had to come from flame. Appliances could begin replacing hand labor. Pumps could change how water reached the house. Radios connected isolated homes to distant information. But electric heat itself was not always the immediate replacement for wood. In many rural places, wood remained cheap, familiar, and locally available. Families could adopt electricity for lighting and still keep a wood stove. They could buy manufactured goods while continuing to cut fuel from nearby land. Old and new systems often lived side by side. That is one reason wood heating survived so long in mountain regions. It offered something modern systems sometimes did not. Independence. If you had land, tools, strength, and access to timber, you could produce your own fuel. No monthly fuel delivery was required. No electric grid was required. A winter storm could block the road, and the stove could still burn. That advantage never disappeared. What changed was the value people placed on the labor required to maintain it. Imagine 2 winter mornings. In the first, the room has cooled overnight. Someone gets out of bed, checks the coals, adds kindling, carries in more wood, and waits for useful heat. In the second, someone turns a control. That difference is enormous. Not because the second system is more dramatic, because it removes a job, then remove another job. No ash to empty, no pile of split fuel to keep dry, no trips to the yard before dawn, no sparks landing on the floor, no need to arrange the entire evening around one hot corner. Modern heating did not simply make houses warmer, it made warmth less visible. That may be the biggest transformation of all. In the cabin, heat was always present as a task. You saw the wood, you felt the weight of it, you heard the fire, you smelled the smoke, you watched the flames. You knew when the pile was shrinking. You knew exactly who had worked to produce the warmth around you. With central heating, much of that process disappears behind walls, ducts, pipes, wires, furnaces, boilers, thermostats, and fuel systems outside the room. The house becomes warm without making the family watch warmth being made. And once people experienced that kind of convenience, many old hardships became harder to romanticize. Cold bedrooms were not charming when you had to sleep in them. Smoke was not atmospheric when it irritated your eyes. Cutting wood was not rustic when your back hurt. A leaking chimney was not picturesque when sparks threatened the roof. Getting up before dawn to revive the fire was not a lifestyle aesthetic. It was work. Still, modernization did not erase the knowledge immediately. Older people remembered which wood burned well. They knew how to read a chimney. They knew how to bank coals. They knew how to patch drafts. They knew how to sleep comfortably in a colder room than their grandchildren might accept. Some of that knowledge remains useful even now. Close off unused space. Stop drafts. Keep insulation dry. Warm the person, not just the room. Use fuel efficiently. Prepare before the weather turns. Those ideas sound modern because good building science still depends on them. But mountain families learn versions of them through repetition long before anyone needed technical vocabulary. The technologies changed. The physics did not. Heat still moves toward cold. Air still leaks through openings. Dry insulation still works better than wet insulation. A smaller heated space still requires less energy than a larger one. And human comfort still depends on more than the number on a thermostat. So when modern heating finally became ordinary, it did not prove that old Appalachian families had somehow defeated winter incorrectly. It proved how much labor they had been spending to solve the same physical problems. And that leaves us with one final comparison before we put the whole system together. If we placed a historic cabin beside a modern house on the same freezing night, where exactly would the old cabin lose the most heat? The answer tells us why every trick we have covered mattered. And it reveals just how hard that small fire was working. If you placed a 19th century Appalachian cabin beside a modern insulated house on the same freezing night, the difference would not begin with the size of the fire. It would begin with the shell. The modern house is designed to slow heat wherever it tries to escape. Insulation fills cavities, weather stripping closes moving joints, cork seals small cracks, windows are built to resist heat flow. The ceiling or roof contains an insulating layer. The entire structure is treated as one connected thermal boundary. Modern Department of Energy guidance still emphasizes insulation and air sealing because uncontrolled air leakage directly increases heating losses and reduces comfort. The old cabin was different. It could be solid, skillfully built, and perfectly useful for its time, yet still have far more places where indoor warmth could move toward the cold outside. Surviving Appalachian cabins preserve the basic ingredients: stacked log walls, simple openings, large fireplaces or chimneys, compact rooms, and joints between logs that required sealing. The National Park Service's trail cabin on the Blue Ridge Parkway is only about 12 feet by 12 feet, and its missing chinking now leaves visible spaces between the logs. Those gaps show us exactly where the winter battle was happening. Start at the wall. A log is a substantial piece of wood, and wood slows heat movement better than highly conductive materials such as metal. But the wall is not one continuous object. It is a stack. Every joint between two logs becomes a potential pathway for moving air. That is why chinking mattered so much. Historic chinking could contain clay, sand, lime, silt, ash, dirt, and other locally available material. It was packed between the logs to close the joints, help keep water out, and provide some temperature control. Remove it, and the wall becomes something very different. Wind no longer has to push through solid timber. It only has to find the seam. In a modern house, air sealing attacks the same problem with different materials. Seal the cracks and less conditioned air escapes. Leave them open, and the heating system has to keep replacing what disappears. The physics did not change. Only the tools did. Now move upward. Warm indoor air rises toward the upper part of the cabin. A loft can take advantage of that. Sleep above the main room and you may occupy some of the air already warmed by the hearth below. But then you are closer to the roof. And the roof is another boundary between the family and winter. A modern house often places substantial insulation above the occupied rooms because insulation slows heat flow through that upper shell. The Department of Energy describes higher R values as providing greater resistance to heat flow. An early cabin did not possess anything approaching a modern, insulated attic assembly. So the loft lived in a strange compromise. Move upward, and you may gain warmth. Move upward, and you also approach the cold roof. The same feature helps and hurts. Then look downward. A historic cabin floor was not necessarily sitting over a sealed, conditioned foundation. Cold ground or outdoor air beneath a simple floor could keep those boards uncomfortable even while the fire was burning strongly. That creates the temperature map we have followed throughout this story. Hot near the hearth. Cool farther away. Warmer air higher up. Cold surfaces around the shell. Cold floor below. Cold roof above. And people somewhere in between. So instead of rebuilding the house every winter, the family solved many of those problems locally. Shoes protect feet. Socks add another barrier. A rug or hide, where available, interrupts the cold floor. A bed lifts the sleeper away from it. Bedding traps warmth around the body. Clothing creates insulation that moves wherever the person moves. The body becomes the final heated room. Windows and doors create another set of weaknesses. Every opening interrupts the wall. A door has to move, so its edges cannot simply be packed permanently shut. A window admits light but replaces solid wall with another material and another set of joints. And every time the exterior door opens, the carefully managed interior is suddenly connected to outdoor winter. Cold air rushes into the lower part of the room. Warmer air escapes. The door closes. Now the fire has another small debt to repay. This is why the most basic behaviours mattered. Bring several things in during one trip. Do not leave the door standing open. Finish outside chores before settling for the evening. Keep what you will need overnight near the hearth. These actions cost nothing. They save wood anyway. Then there is the chimney. The chimney is the strangest part of the whole comparison because it is an intentional escape route. The fire cannot function safely without moving combustion gases outside. Smoke must leave. Hot gases must rise. Air must reach the fire. So even while the family patches unwanted cracks in the walls, the house preserves one large controlled pathway specifically designed to move hot material outdoors. The heating system produces energy and immediately sacrifices some of it so people can breathe. An open fireplace makes that bargain especially obvious. Hot gases rise into the chimney. Room air follows. Replacement air enters through openings elsewhere. The fire keeps burning. The room keeps leaking. Now imagine the whole cabin as one slow-moving machine. Wood enters through the door. Cold air enters through cracks. Air reaches the fire. The fire releases heat. People absorb part of it. Walls absorb part. Food absorbs part. Warm air rises. Smoke leaves through the chimney. Heat crosses the roof. Walls, windows, door, and floor. The woodpile becomes smaller. Then the cycle begins again. That is why building the biggest possible fire was never a complete solution. If heat is leaving rapidly, more fuel attacks only one side of the equation. The smarter strategy is the one we have been uncovering all night. Make heat, then defend it. Seal the log joints. Keep the roof sound. Close unnecessary openings. Use the warmest parts of the structure. Protect the body with clothing. Protect the sleeper with bedding. Reduce unnecessary trips through the door. Gather people where the useful heat already exists. And accept that some parts of the house will remain cold. That final point may be the hardest one for a modern viewer to feel. The cabin did not need to defeat winter everywhere. It only needed to defeat winter where people were. A modern heating system may warm a hallway nobody is using. The cabin can leave the far corner cold. A modern system heats bedroom air. The cabin can concentrate insulation around the bed instead. A thermostat responds automatically when temperature drops. The cabin waits for a human being to notice. That difference explains almost everything. The old system uses less machinery because it demands more attention, more adjustment, more clothing, more movement, more labour, more acceptance of temperature swings. The modern house does the opposite. It spends insulation, equipment, fuel, and engineering to reduce how often the occupants have to think about warmth. That is why comparing the two buildings is not really a contest over which one can create the hotter room. The interesting question is how the older cabin remained usable despite losing heat in so many directions. And by now the answer is visible. It never depended on one feature. Not the logs, not the fireplace, not the chimney, not the quilts, not the woodpile. The cabin stayed warm enough because daily life itself was organized around a limited supply of useful heat. Tomorrow's wood was prepared before tonight's fire needed it. Cracks were filled before the wind found them. Beds were insulated before people climbed inside. Chores were grouped before the door opened. Families gathered before the room cooled. And when winter became severe, the system could contract further until the true heated environment was almost nothing more than a hearth, several bodies, and the layers wrapped around them. That brings us to the final delivery. Because once every wall, tool, habit, and person is placed back into the same picture, the answer to our original question becomes surprisingly simple. Appalachian cabins did not stay warm by defeating the cold. They stayed warm by deciding exactly how much of it they actually had to defeat. By the time we reach the end of this story, the old Appalachian cabin looks very different from the romantic version. It is not a wooden box blowing evenly with heat. It is not a place where a huge fireplace somehow overpowers winter. And it is not proof that people in the past were naturally tougher than everyone today. It is a carefully managed compromise. The cabin survives winter because nearly every part of daily life is arranged around one simple fact. Useful heat is scarce. That scarcity begins outside. A tree has to become fuel before it can become warmth. The wood has to be cut, split, moved, stacked, dried, carried inside, and fed into the fire at the right time. If the wood is wet, the fire struggles. If the pile is too small, the household loses flexibility. If someone is sick or injured, the fuel system becomes harder to operate. So warmth starts long before anyone feels warm. Then the heat reaches the room. If the family is using an open hearth, the fireplace gives strong radiant warmth close to the flames while also sending hot gases up the chimney. Air follows that movement, Cold replacement air finds cracks in the walls, edges around doors, gaps near floors, and other weak points in the shell. That is why chinking matters. That is why shutters matter. That is why the smallest openings matter. A crack only an inch wide may look insignificant when you stand outside the cabin in summer. On a freezing night, with wind pressing against the wall and a fire pulling air toward the chimney, that same opening becomes part of the heating system. Seal it, and you save fuel. Leave it open, and the fire pays for it. The roof creates the same bargain. Warm air rises. A sleeping loft can use some of that rising heat, but the roof above it is cold, and early roofs do not have the deep insulation of a modern attic. So people use vertical space carefully. They sleep where some warmth collects. Then they add bedding to finish the job. This may be the most important idea in the entire story. The cabin does not have to heat every cubic foot of space to the same temperature. It can heat the person. Clothing creates one layer. Blankets create another. A quilt creates another. A feather bed, when available, traps still more air. Several people sharing bedding contribute body heat to the same small pocket. The room may remain cold. The bed can still be warm enough. The same strategy applies during the day. People gather near the hearth. They cook there, mend there, dry clothing there, warm water there, talk there, watch children there. Instead of spreading household life evenly through the building, they cluster activities around the place where useful heat already exists. That is not a failure of the house. It is the operating method of the house. The old cabin is less like a modern, climate-controlled box and more like a campsite with walls, a roof, stored fuel, better bedding, and generations of accumulated knowledge. But those walls matter. They block wind. They create a protected volume. They give the fire a chance to change the local environment instead of trying to heat the entire outdoors. The chimney matters too, even though it throws heat away. Smoke has to leave. Combustion gases have to leave. The family needs breathable air more than it needs every last bit of thermal energy. So the heating system deliberately sacrifices some warmth for safety. That trade-off appears everywhere. Seal drafts, but do not prevent the fire from getting air. Burn enough wood to stay warm, but not so aggressively that sparks or overheated surfaces threaten the house. Sleep closer to rising heat, but protect bedding from flame. Bring fuel inside before a storm, but do not stack combustible material recklessly against the hearth. Stay indoors during severe weather, but still care for animals, carry water, and handle the jobs that cannot wait. There is no perfect setting. There is judgment. That is why experience becomes so valuable. After enough winters, the household knows where the cold enters first. It knows which wood burns slowly. It knows how many armloads a bad night might consume. It knows which child needs another blanket. It knows when the chimney is drawing badly. It knows whether the roof is starting to leak. It knows when to bring extra water inside. It knows that waiting until the storm arrives is already too late. In that sense, knowledge becomes part of the insulation, and family labour becomes part of the machinery. One person splits wood, another carries smaller pieces. Someone tends food, someone repairs clothing, someone watches the children, someone checks the animals. Someone keeps the bed dry. Someone notices that the fire is fading. The cabin stays warm because people keep it warm. Then the community extends the system beyond the household. A neighbour can help cut wood. A relative can repair a chimney. Someone can bring food during illness. Someone can lend a saw, horse, wagon, or strong pair of hands. The house may stand alone on a slope, but survival does not always happen alone. And that helps explain why modern heating felt so transformative when it finally arrived. The great luxury was not simply a higher indoor temperature. It was the removal of constant attention. A furnace does not need someone to split its fuel every afternoon. A thermostat does not need someone to wake before dawn and stir coals. Insulated walls do not need mud pushed back into cracked joints. Central heat does not require the family to move every evening activity into one hot corner. Modern systems make warmth quieter. Older systems made warmth visible. You saw it in the woodpile. You heard it in the axe. You smelled it in the smoke. You felt it in the cold floor. You carried it through the door. You protected it under quilts. You watched it disappear up the chimney. You measured it by how many pieces of wood remained before morning. That visibility is probably why the old cabin can look so cozy to us now. We see the flame. We see the logs. We see the blankets. We see the snow outside. What we do not immediately see is the labour behind every warm minute. And yet the system deserves admiration for a different reason. Not because it was comfortable, because it was intelligent. It used local materials. It concentrated heat instead of wasting it on empty space. It layered protection. It adjusted to weather. It relied on repair rather than perfection. It used the human body, the bed, the room, the fire, the house, and the community as connected parts of one winter strategy. So how did Appalachian cabins stay warm before modern heating? Usually, they did not stay warm in the modern sense. They stayed warm enough. A hot hearth, a small room, dry wood, sealed gaps, heavy clothing, deep bedding, shared body heat, careful chores, constant attention, and people who understood exactly where the heat was going. That is the real answer. The cabin never defeated the mountain winter. It simply made one small circle inside it where people could keep living until morning. And night after night, one armload of wood at a time, that was enough